You must tell me all your secrets. Remember, we must share everything together. Everything.
Hello again. You're listening to an offshoot of Girls, Guts, and Giallo that I do with my brother in filth, Kamikaze Jones. And this is Anal Auteurs, Part 3. We're talking today about Wakefield Poole. Hi, Kamikaze.
Hey Annie, how's it going?
It's going good. And you're here with us from art residency land.
Yeah, I'm overexposed and I've been raw barebacking a series of unhinged summer art residencies, and this is the last leg of my tour, and you know, I'm hanging in here. It's been great. I'm at Art Oh My right now, which is a kind of primarily a sculpture art facility slash like garden slash like institution in upstate New York in Ghent, and I'm here for the international music residency, and I'm looking at archival porn sound and like how that can interact with the voice and like kind of camp affect, and it's been a lot of fun so far.
Amazing. Yeah, and we were just before the recording, we were like, I'm amazed that we're even doing this because we're both so busy. But the reason that we felt it was really important to push through and record this is twofold. And one, because the subject that we're talking about today is just perfect for summer, and we really wanted to get it out there before the summer is over. And number two, we really wanted to tell the listeners of this show about the San Francisco Porn Film Festival that's happening this weekend. So Jiz Lee, who's one of the organizers of the festival and one of the founders of pinklabel.tv, sent us a really wonderful email. Hi, Jiz, if you're listening. They're a fan of Anal Auteurs, and they reached out to us about getting us involved with the Porn Film Festival, and were kind enough to give us memberships to pinklabel.tv. So we wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thanks, Jiz, so much for the invitation, and thank you to Shine Louise Houston for also being a fan of the podcast. And San Francisco Porn Film Festival, I believe, started officially today online, and there's Annie, you're going to be on the field for the stuff that's taking place in person, right?
Yeah, so the day that I'm definitely going to watch a lot of it online, but the day that I'm planning on, because I live in the Bay, planning on actually going to the Porn Film Festival in person is Saturday, because that's got the most stuff that I'm interested in, like the piece about Big Gay Sir and Rites of Spring and baby girls birthday gangbang. So I'm really excited about that. It started, actually, I was reading on the website, in 1970. So with the first International Erotic Film Festival at the Presidio Theater. So it's not the same film festival, but the San Francisco has a rich history of being the first city in the United States to host public screenings of hardcore sex.
Yeah, and I think a lot of, Shine's work and a lot of Jiz's work really corresponds to the theme that we're going to be talking about today, which is the seminal, quote unquote, filmmaker Wakefield Poole, who I think a lot of people primarily know through his work Boys in the Sand, but has like a rich, multifaceted history, much like a lot of these auteurs of gay porn in the 1970s, a man who wore many hats, kind of like, like a Renaissance character, a polymath. And, this speaks to this slippage and this threshold that often exists in sex work and in the porn industry, especially in the 70s. And I was reading something in this anthology that I have, Porn Archives, that was recommended to me by my professor Alexander Juhas, who was worked heavily with Cheryl Dunye in The Watermelon Woman, but also is a brilliant archivist, artist, AIDS activist. And there's an interview in here with Morel Miller Young and Shine Louise Houston that talks about Shine's love for 1970s like hardcore gay pornography, and how it was like an era of like unprecedented experimentation with narrative forms, with innovative editing techniques, with making the private and the personal political. And Wakefield's work speaks a lot about, or speaks to this idea of experimental narrative cinema, but also to like a nascent form of docu-porn. And I think a lot of the work that is coming out or being showcased in the San Francisco Porn Film Festival this week and beyond is very much in this tradition of both experimental surrealist porn and also docu-porn. So that is the reason that we wanted to have this tie-in, and also just to talk about the idea of Slut Summer and Fire Island and like cultural representation of Fire Island. And Boys in the Sand is this groundbreaking work that kind of externalized a lot of the euphoria that people experience in this very particular queer space, but also maybe perhaps unwittingly some of the issues that surround this psychospatial environment.
Oh, absolutely. It's such a good way of putting it. And we can also talk a little bit about the doll invasion that just happened on Fire Island, where hundreds of trans people took over Fire Island, which is historically very cis white gay man kind of paradise. So that's fucking amazing. Power to our trans siblings for doing that. And I did want to read a little bit of the copy for the San Francisco Porn Film Festival, just so people get more of a formal idea of how you can attend if you want to from listening to this episode. So the San Francisco Porn Film Festival is a multi-generational celebration of the industry's history and a look forward to the innovations of today's adult filmmakers pushing the genre of sexual cinema. An accessible hybrid event that takes place both online and in person, screenings and filmmaker talks broadcast live from San Francisco to an international audience, powered by pinklabel.tv. The 2023 festival runs online August 16th to 27th, with programs broadcasting live from the Brava Theater August 18th to 19th. A collection of 69 titles present an erotic smorgasbord with something for everyone in a wide assortment of films exploring sexuality, spanning experimental to documentary. Attendees can look forward to in-person and virtual screenings, socials, filmmaker chats, and a vibrant collection of well-crafted and thought-provoking erotic and adult films. This year's festival features a fresh lineup of films premiering this year, as well as a look back at classic LGBTQ movies. This year also sees a trend coming out after the initial wave of the pandemic isolation: group sex scenes. The festival closes with Big Bang, a curation of who's who in contemporary porn making around the world. Films from the Bay Area and beyond push the genre, expanding the cinematic landscape of sexuality. So just Google San Francisco Porn Film Festival or go to pinklabel.tv. And the films that we are talking about today are all available on pinklabel.tv. And Jiz was kind enough to gift Kamikaze and I memberships, and I have been absolutely making the most of it. You can rent them individually, or you can pay. You can buy a subscription. Both Kamikaze and I highly recommend supporting them, because this is an amazing resource for pornographic
go out
history.
and do it now. As soon as you hear these words leave our lips, there's so much to unpack, so much to unplug and then plug again.
We just can't help ourselves. So
I do want to mention, Annie, just maybe there's a couple of things that I was seeing in the curation.
Yes, please.
For the San Francisco Porn Film Festival that I do want to plug, just because they're of particular interest to me, and I think also to you, and pertinent to a lot of the programming you do. Big Sur Gay Porn, which you mentioned, by Ryan White, is a documentary about cult filmmaker Tom DeSimone, who is known for such pornographic films as Confessions of a Male Groupie, which is a personal favorite of mine, but also cult classics such as Reform Schoolgirls. And it is a documentary about Tom revisiting the production of a lost gay film and resurrecting youthful adventures on the California coast. So very pertinent to the overall vibe of what we're going to be talking about today. There's also something called Rites of Spring that is produced by Four Chambers that is a folk horror porn that is influenced by the resurgence of films such as Midsummer and also inspired by Rites of Spring by Stravinsky. So I find that personally interesting, especially since a lot of Wakefield's work deals with classical music, traditional art forms like ballet. And then there's something called Beer and Loving with Los Bangers by Paulita Papel that looks very interesting because it's some sort of like orgiastic take on Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. So those are the three that I clocked that I think maybe are of particular interest to me, but there's so much amazing programming. And I also love the idea of one of the curatorial series being Big Bang, because it reminds me of this kind of neo-creationist myth that actually does exist in a lot of these gay porns that we've been covering, not just Wakefield Poole, but also Fred Halstead, and to an extent, Peter Derome.
Yes, and speaking of folk horror, just to plug myself for a second, I just presented The Wicker Man at another historic theater in San Francisco, Four Star Theater, and I have actually a bi-monthly program there where I every other month I present a film at Four Star Theater, and this was the 50th anniversary of The Wicker Man, and we had a beautiful restoration, and I did an introduction to I was very happy that there was a packed house for this historic theater for this weird fucking movie. And it's really important that we keep things like this alive. So if you're in the Bay Area, come check me out. My next one is going to be October. I'm going to be screening The Hunger because it's the 40th anniversary. So of course, right? Of course, I'm going to pick that one. So come on out and follow me on social media, Girls Guts Giallo, to find out what day that's going to be, and come and support really important things that are happening in the Bay, like the San Francisco Porn Film Festival and these screenings at Four Star. And I think, now we can talk about Wakefield Poole, and we can start with Boys in the Sand from 1971. I think we're going to focus the most on this one because Fire Island, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say about Boys in the Sand. It was considered one of the groundbreaking, moments of porno chic in the golden age of porno, where it was the first, arguably the first gay pornography that went mainstream in cinemas and had sold out screenings, and was attended by Liza Minnelli and Andy Warhol and various other characters of the time. There's something interesting to be said about Wakefield Poole, and that we were talking about that he's a Renaissance man. He had a background in dance, and in particular ballet. He joined the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo in 1957. He was raised in Jacksonville, Florida before doing so, and he became, primarily a dancer, choreographer, and a director on television and Broadway. And he was married to a woman named Nancy Van Rijn, who was a Broadway performer and choreographer from 1964 to 1968. And this was all, I think, before he started pioneering gay pornography as a medium and what he became most known for.
Yeah, and I listened to the Ask Anybody episode about this film, and if you are interested in a full history of Boys in the Sand, or any of the films we're talking about, I believe they have an episode on Bijou and Take One as well. Absolutely go listen to Ask Anybody. It's such an incredible historic research. The hosts do so much work for that show. And I know as a host myself, I can hear listening to it how much work they do. And yeah, we're going to be focusing more on sort of as always, more thematic or symbolic or tangents related to this film. But if you really want a history, check that out. So Boys in the Sand is kind of apt because it's to be talking about it right now, because the title is a play on Boys in the Band, which most people know from the William Friedkin movie, R.I.P. He just passed last week. And the film is also, it was kind of like the first cultural, like mainstream cultural touchstone for gay men. And it premiered, the play that the movie is based on, premiered in 1968, written by Mark Crowley. And this is an interesting tie-in because, like Kamikaze was saying, Wakefield Poole really comes from the theater world. He was a dancer, choreographer, theatrical director, in addition to being a porn auteur. And it also ties into some of the history of theater on Fire Island, the Kamikaze that you were telling me about.
Yeah, so I did like kind of like a deep dive into like certain, like the proliferation of queer people living and claiming Fire Island. And it starts, there's like a rich queer literary tradition. Oscar Wilde had a reprieve from his American lecture series in 1882 for several days at Cherry Grove's Perkinson's Hotel. Walt Whitman contemplated the wrecks and wreckers of Fire Island in 1857, which sounds loosely tops and bottoms coded. There's a really, really interesting ecological history. Like it's kind of an anomaly that the sunken forest exists because of as far as I can gather, it's protected by dual dune formations. So the type of diversity of the plant life in the sunken forest is classified as highly rare and probably took over 300 years to develop from various aspects of wind erosion and wind carrying, non-native seeds into the sunken forest. So, I could proselytize and like get like a wax poetic and get a little tender queer about queer resilience in regards to the sunken forest and the meat rack and stuff like that. But the history is palpable and kind of there. And then in the 1920s, Fire Island's remote location attracted a new crowd of thirsty mainlanders, and it was a lot of New York's gay theater personalities. And there's a Manhattan Theater Club that started rehearsing out there. And there was like a lack of policing and persecution and a guaranteed freedom and safety, to kind of experiment and be a bit more conspicuous about queer identities. But at that point, they were still kind of outnumbered by the island's wealthy heterosexuals. And then apparently there was a great hurricane of 1938, and a lot of the cottages were destroyed, and a lot of the straight locals started renting out their properties to a younger metropolitan crowd. And that's really when it got popping off in terms of like a developing, prosperous gay enclave, not without its own issues of class and race, obviously. Yeah, I mean, the history of the island is so fascinating, especially with Boys in the Sand by Wakefield Poole being such a prominent representation and cultural artifact from it, because obviously after that, it became an elegiac or, mournful place, or a place of healing and mobilization for the AIDS epidemic. And, now it's, what it is, as we can tell from certain characterizations of it in popular media by, Ryan Murphy and, the new Fire Island movie. And yeah, anything to say about that? You grew up in New York, right?
I did grow up in New York, and Fire Island has always felt like kind of off limits to me a little bit as a lesbian, even though there is like its own lesbian history as well alongside gay men's history here. And it's actually not something that I know a lot about, so I won't posture to, but I feel like I actually know more about the gay men's history of the island. But it, coming up in the early 2000s, it's I've always kind of known it as it is now, and not as the kind of or like I had rich kids that I went to school with who would be on the straight part of the island with their families, and it was like never something my family could afford to do. But going later as an adult gay person, I was like, oh my God, there's so many men. I don't necessarily feel welcome here. So hearing about the trans takeover was really inspiring to me because, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's just, I think that like you said, it became kind of a place of like resting and healing, but it's not accessible to rest and heal there unless you're of a certain class status. So because like dykes and trans people are just usually, because of the wage gap, usually less well off than especially white gay men, it's really powerful to hear about hundreds of trans people descending on Fire Island and taking it over. And I think that people should go back to making radical gay porn. Although on Fire Island, although this is not a radical film.
Yes. It is interesting. I think that a lot of people considered it radical at the time, and I think that the politic was, maybe perhaps like in an interesting way, like nodding towards homo respectability, or at least destigmatization of like gay sex, in the idea that like, oh wow, no one's in pain and no one's going to be like the tragically die after this like like expression of pleasure, or that kind of thing. But even all of that, and we can actually get more into the idea of the last vignette of Boys in the Sand, which is like an interracial scene, as like a porno ethnography, and like the troubling kind of implications of that scene and how it's perceived from a white male gaze. But yeah, I think from what I've gathered from like archival interviews, Wakefield Poole was very much like, I wanted to present my idea or my conceptualization of pleasure unfettered from the straight gaze, or from stigma or shame. And I guess that was pretty novel at the time.
Yeah, exactly. Like historically subversive. But it, viewed through a contemporary lens. I was listening to some of his interviews, and he was saying like he wanted this to be a much more romantic, sort of dreamy view of gay sex. And like you said, at the time, that was quite different than the mainstream idea of what gay sex between men is. But I think what's coming up for me too is thinking about that new movie Red, White, and Royal Blue.
Did you watch it?
I haven't watched it yet, but I plan on punishing myself later tonight by watching. And I think now in 2023, I think showing like dirty, rough gay sex is much more radical, because so much media about gay men is honestly, in my opinion, filtered through like a straight women's gaze. Because of the proliferation of fan fiction, and how much straight women like adore and love to watch like really loving sex scenes between men. I'm not saying that that's like a negative thing, but it is interesting that is like what people know now of gay media.
Yes, and it's all representation.
Yes,
And I think
yes.
we both agree that it's pretty conspicuously most of the time a neoliberal impulse, to have like these kind of like positive representations of queer sex that where like nothing goes wrong or nothing goes awry, or like it's clumsy. I mean, like we've talked about this, like I want to see like the Kate Hudson like Vom Dom rom-com. I want to see the radical like fisting streaming on Netflix, because the implications of that would be very interesting. I will say that I did watch Red, White, and Royal Blue while I was decompressing.
Yes, tell me about
it. From my travels. And I did not hate it as much as I expected. That being said, I might have been at a vulnerable moment where I just needed like an ambient wash.
You needed to feel loved and cherished by a prince.
I mean, there is something novel about seeing like the heir to the British throne like bottom for the first time on camera.
Totally.
Even if it is,
yeah.
Like rendered palatable. It was interesting. I'll wait to hear your take on it.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of brings me back to like, I'm even going to contradict myself from what I just said, because I do think any representation of gay sex is like inherently subversive, no matter what kind it is. But as like a leather woman, I think I so bristle at this idea that loving like sort of more languid gay sex is like more authentic to
totally.
Yeah. And what something that Wakefield Poole referenced, what were SM films.
Mhm.
Like he is talking, he's like, oh, all this gay porn, it only showed the rough stuff. And he's talking about a film where a hitchhiker gets picked up by a drag queen who holds a knife to his throat and assaults him. And that he miscredited that as Highway Hustler, but the Ask Anybody folks think that he's actually talking about a film called Bruised Angel.
Mhm.
And yeah, there's always this kind of war between assimilationist gays and leather gays about like what should we be showing? What kind of sex
The
should we be
eternal
showing?
dodgeball match.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. The sex war is constantly raging.
Yeah. I think there is something interesting to be said about like cruising pastoralisms, especially as they apply to this film, as well as to like classic gay porns of the 70s, like and how the pastoralism is subverted, like in like Fred Halstead's like films that we talked about, and also like Arthur Bresson's Passing Strangers. Like there's like this kind of diaristic, like almost like pastoral nod, and like it kind of plays with the high and the low, and like the object, and like the classical notions of beauty, like with all this classical music, and then like like, and it is assimilationist, but then like obviously Fred Halstead plays with it in a very interesting way. And then Wakefield Poole kind of has like a dark night of the soul at a certain point in his career, and like starts making like hardcore fisting loops. So he definitely has a change of heart, arguably.
Yeah,
So
probably inspired by how mainstream and his films became. I mean, the line for the first showing of Boys in the Sand reached across to 7th Avenue. The film made back most of its production and promotion budgets the day it opened, grossing
mhm,
close to $6,000 in the first hour, nearly
mhm.
25,000 during its first week. It landed on Variety's list of the week's 50 top grossing films. So it's the first kind of like crossover gay porn to reach like a superstar mainstream status. And I think it is worth examining how a film like Boys in the Sand is able to reach a more mainstream popular status than something like Sex Tool or LA Plays Itself.
Yeah, yeah. And you see this kind of tradition of like the hazy, oniric daydream gay porn, obviously in like Call Me by Your Name, to an extent in Brokeback Mountain, like these kind of like, like these remote landscapes that are activated by some sort of forbidden passion. And with Boys in the Sand, it's much more like this is kind of like a white heterotopia, to borrow a theoretical construct from Michel Foucault, like this space that has its own rules, its own kind of sense of autonomy. It's a discursive space that could be, disturbing or utopian. The casino is a good example. The brothel is a good example. And Fire Island very much exists in the collective imaginary as that.
Very ancient Greece. Like just, two beautiful men romping in the sand. And like the sex is hardcore. Like I'm not saying it's not, like explicit. Like I was actually quite surprised by the the like the explicitness of the film, almost because of how Wakefield, I watched it with the commentary, and because of how Wakefield Poole like describes it as like this sort of dreamy romantic thing. I guess I wasn't expecting to see like huge cocks going into assholes like in close up. So I do love that that's still there. And also the history, I also didn't mention that it's not the first erotic gay film to feature Fire Island. Like Andy Warhol's My Hustler is one of them, and but it's this very sort of pastoral, like Kamikaze is saying, white gay cis gay man fantasy, that is very like harkening back to a tradition which is even referenced in Call Me by Your Name of ancient classical love between men,
Yeah,
which definitely
pedestry,
has its
Hadrian.
place.
What'd you say?
Which definitely has its place. Like I'm not saying that to be shady.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because, obviously, like, I think Fire Island in this film is like considered like Edenic or like, kind of like, like neo-creationist. And also the beginning of Bijou is like that in a different way, in a more like kind of post-industrial way. But it's like these kind of like origin myths where like, Casey Donovan, this beautiful blonde boy, emerges from the seminal foams of Fire Island's seas, like Aphrodite, and like emerges from the waves wearing a cock ring, and in the first vignette, Peter Fisk, who was Wakefield Poole's lover at the time, plays the other character in the vignette. And there's something to be said about like availabilism in the way that Kemba Fowler says it, because a lot of these, porn films are kind of like using the resources that are at hand and very much like DIY endeavors, from set design, from like, the availability of certain cast members to like casting your lovers. But I think it's also a rich tradition in queer cinema in general. So there's that, and Casey Donovan is a really interesting character. I also, one of my loose notes was that like it seems like Wakefield Poole, more so than other filmmakers we've tackled so far, is kind of like a verse for verse pioneer, like very much an advocate of flip fuck.
Yes, yes. That's something he talks about in the commentary, and I think that was I think that was like, honestly, I get it, and also like I'm probably biased too, because like as a dom top, I'm like, we're still valid, but he's
tops right.
Yeah. He is talking about in the commentary how it was obnoxious to him at the time that there was always a top bottom dichotomy. Like there was always a man giving and a man receiving, and that's the parlance of the time in communities was like very focused on like, are you top or bottom? And there wasn't verse rights, like he said. So he was very adamant in his films that like everybody's topping and bottoming. It's very, people are giving and receiving. He wanted everything to be very verse. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it might be a bit, hippie, pejorative, countercultural, especially in the choice of the music too, which is a bit omnivorous, maybe as a blessing and a curse. Because you have this classical music, you have like these Eastern, like Buddhist motifs that emerge at certain parts, perhaps a bit conspicuously in the third vignette with the interracial segment. And you have also like during the middle segment, which is like lounging by the pool, there's also, we should say, there's like kind of like a fabular element to each of these vignettes. There's like either dream sequences or some sort of like divine emergence, or this idea of immanence, and like, the idea of the divine in all bodies, like, all, in this particular instance, like all white bodies. Yeah, there's something to be said about this kind of like daydream aesthetic and how the music reflects that. Because in the middle segment, which is like Casey Donovan is lounging by the pool and writing like, like letters, which at first I thought was like a letter to Congress for some reason, because he's reading the newspaper and it's like the historic raids on like queer spaces. And I'm like, is he writing to Congress? It turns out he's writing for like a mail order, like magical pill or like tablet that he throws into the pool that turns into
dick
like
pills.
Yeah.
He's like trying to get gas station dick pills through the magazine.
Horny goat weed. So he sends away for some horny goat weed and he throws it into the pool, and it manifests in this beautiful hunk. So there is like kind of a dreamlike element to all of these things, but it is kind of like a strange emulsification of like loose hippie countercultural like gay motifs in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. Hippie's pejorative. Yeah.
Huh?
Hippie pejorative. Yeah, totally. And especially with the interracial scene, it's just like it's racist. Like that's, it's very like racially charged.
I have a lot to say about that. Okay.
Please tell me.
I was reading, let me just like, I want to do this one right, because I found like a really beautiful article or essay. Let me see. Basically about glass. Okay, so it's basically about porno ethnography in Boys in the Sand, and it's by a writer named Jerry Young Ching Cheng. And it is about that particular scene and how basically what happens is Casey is like asleep in this like modernist glass building that has a lot of reflective surfaces and a lot of transparency. And what I was reading is that basically as like affluent white gay men moved to the island in the 60s and 70s at the advent of disco and like a lot of like, the gay rights movement, a lot of the low-hanging like wooden cottages that characterized the primary architecture of Fire Island gave way to these glass modernist architectures. And like obviously with the proliferation of like people like David Hockney painting in Fire Island or Andy Warhol vacationing there. So there's this idea of the glass modernist building in this particular scene as a how do I put this? As an instrument of class and also an instrument of kink, because their whole interaction is Casey Donovan is in this like, like modernist apartment, and he sees this black handyman from below, and he starts flirting with him through the glass and like kind of like trying to seduce him. And it is like this elaborate dream sequence that is a little confusing because you can't tell if it's like a daydream and then like eventually is made reality, if it's like something that Casey manifested. But the tool belt that this black handyman is wearing is heavily fetishized. And it speaks to a lot of the, marginalized identities that existed on Fire Island at the time, or, Black or POC people being either live-in boyfriends or service workers or hotel workers, and that being the only way that they had accessibility to this space. So it is kind of a fetishization of class and race in the most overt way. And it uses this kind of guise or this lens of modernist architecture as like an extension of the white male gay gaze. So yeah.
So well put. Yeah, it's very, and it's actually uncommon to see Black men in gay porn of this era. Not on this series, because a lot of the films we're talking about have interracial sequences like this. But they're all very, you're probably noticing a theme, which is that they're all very highly fetishized. It's never just two men having sex. Like, it's always like, it's a black man and a white man having sex. And that's something that porn suffers from today. It's very, the miscegenation taboo is very alive and well in pornography. Of course, there's a lot of independent performers who are combating that, but it's still very, very much present.
Well, I will add that it's just strange that this scene kind of like condenses the stereotype of the mystical Negro and like the young buck into one. And literally speaks to the idea of the glass closet by Eve Sedgwick, which is like expounded upon further with the work of C. Riley Snorton in terms of like Black working class masculinities and the idea of being on the down low. And all that is like, unfortunately, palpably present in this one vignette, with like the literal, like, Casey on the balcony looking down at this handyman and inviting him to the world, but only in a transactional way.
The Black actor in the sequence, Tommy Moore, he was actually asked to do an interview about this film for a Black gay publication at the time. And they had asked him to do the interview because they thought he was the director because of the name Wakefield. So that, is kind of its own thing. I don't know if I have like commentary about that particularly, but I think that is noteworthy, and also noteworthy of just how uncommon this was, that Tommy Moore was sort of considered honestly a pioneer for doing this movie. So as all things on my show and in this series, things are always there's always double binds. There's always an aspect of subversiveness as well as mainstream ideology sort of clashing.
And, it speaks to this, this idea of Morel Miller Young, who wrote A Taste for Brown Sugar, which is primarily about Black femme representations in the history of pornography. It speaks to this idea of Black performers smuggling representation and, at certain points, radical ideology through the roles that are given to them and through the roles they're presented with. And I'm not sure if this quite happens here, but there is like a rich legacy of that occurring throughout the history of pornography.
Yeah, very well said. It's a really good summation of that book. And people, you should check it out if anybody here is interested in the history of Black performers in pornography. It's really fantastic. So let's talk about Bijou from 1972. Yeah. This was my favorite of the Wakefield Pooles. It's centers around Bill Harrison and his gigantic penis as a construction worker.
I'm glad you said it first.
Right. It's huge. As a construction worker who witnesses a car accident and discovers an invitation to a club called Bijou in the purse of the victim. Very eyes wide shut moment. And he goes to this club and there's he performs all these surreal sex acts. And while I was watching it, like I said, I just could not get over this man's cock. I was like, this is...
You saw more than I, maybe, because maybe just because I'm very anal centric, but I'm glad that it resonated with you.
It really resonated with me. I was really impressed. And when he goes to the club and he's just sort of like being worshipped by everybody, being really like fetishized for his dick, but still, of course, Wakefield Poole always brings out the verse rights. But I mean, this is like the most sort of arty one of the group. Al Goldstein, who was the editor of Screw, which is a porn review magazine at the time, praised the film's sophisticated direction, magnificent photography, and editing. And when asked by Women's Wear Daily what his favorite thing he did on his visit to New York was, French fashion designer Yves Saint Laurent answered, "Seeing Bijou." So very stylish film. Yeah. And this movie also relates so much back to theater and performance with these crazy sets, sculptures, and very dancerly movements.
I have in my notes scrotal mycelium at one point describing the set design.
And it actually, have you seen the movie Kamikaze Blind Beast?
No, what's the deal with that?
It really reminded me of this Japanese film from 1969 called Blind Beast, which is about this blind artist who kidnaps a woman and keeps her in his studio, which is like totally dark, except it has these gigantic, crazy, surreal sculptures of the human body. And she eventually falls in love with him and starts to lose her sight because of being in the darkness, and they just like fuck all over these giant sculptures, and it's crazy. So everybody go watch Blind Beast. It's an amazing movie. But I was wondering if Wakefield Poole had seen that, because it's actually the sculptures are very much like the ones in that movie.
Oh, interesting. There's like a rich history of that. There's like a captivity curation, like an erotic captivity curation we should do at some point together, where it's like women in the dunes. What's that movie? The Collector.
I actually, for my obsession month, back in February 2022, I did a double feature of The Collector and Blind Beast. So I love captivity. So there's a whole rich history there.
And the set design of this film very much harkens to the DIY surrealism of, Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome by Kenneth Anger, who we covered for our impromptu Anal Auteurs Part 2.5 episode a couple months ago. And then also Pink Narcissus by James Bidgood, like these beautiful, like handcrafted, like surrealist sets that create like these incredible multidimensionalities within like someone's apartment. Really, really fascinating work. I also wanted to bring it back to the Al Goldstein because Bijou was named Best Picture of 1972 by Screw, but shared the honor with the film Deep Throat. And according to Poole, Goldstein considered Bijou to be superior, but did not want to honor faggotry over heterosexuality. Um,
Yeah, I mean Wakefield Poole, he had a memoir. I think it came out in, I want to say 2011, called Dirty Pool, and
mhm.
it's just about his his life stories. And something that I love about him and his commentary on Boys in the Sand is just like his own. He is so into his own mythology, and isn't that just like so queer? He just like
So
and
queer and also so Fred Halstead.
yes, exactly. So Fred Halstead, also into his own astrology, like Pisces rising productions, because he's a Pisces. And they're, the gays have always been about astrology. That's we've always been into that, and it really tracks for Boys in the Sand too, and actually Bijou and Take One, because it's very like dreamy and sensual and surreal. I mean, I know this word surreal gets overused a lot these days in film theory discussion, but Bijou truly is in the true definition of the word. And it's, yeah, I mean, it's just you can really see kind of the through line between all of these and the myth making that Wakefield Poole is doing. I mean, something he says in Boys in the Sand is, and that they talk about on Ask Anybody, is that he says he pioneered the cock ring. Like, men were not using cock rings like they were after Boys in the Sand came out. And Elizabeth Purcell said something really funny where they were like, did he pioneer the cock ring? And Elizabeth was like, well, according to Wakefield Poole, he did. Like, he's very into his own myth making of like, I was the first to do this, and
Mhm.
as power to him, as he should. But yeah,
I know many a queer elder who has, an anecdote of, I discovered Patti LaBelle.
yeah,
So, and
exactly.
alert.
Yeah, exactly. It just like the way, like, queer embellishment, queer myth making,
Mhm.
it's like such a part of our history. Um, you know,
And for Kenneth Anger too, like
yeah.
the Hollywood Babylon, like all of that, it's a really innate, and a lot of why, I think maybe straight audiences misunderstood or misinterpreted Hollywood Babylon is because it was camp, and it was like this, albeit sometimes problematic fabrication of like, the parasocial relationships we have with, celebrity, and with people that we, are fanatic about. But I think, yeah, innately self mythology is like one of the best parts about being gay.
Oh, I love it. I love it. I love that you can just be like, yes, I'm considered actually the queen dom top of New York.
Yeah.
And and
Regional folk correspondent.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So let's also talk briefly about Take One from 1977, which I only got to see about 40 minutes of, but Kamikaze watched the whole thing. And it
Mhm.
opens with this ballet sequence. Poole is very indebted to theater and dance, and it's a docu-porn. So
Mhm.
the concept is that Wakefield Poole is interviewing gay men about their fantasies, and then either actors or the men themselves or act them out.
Mhm.
So I was having some like face blindness because like all of these white gay men, 70s white gay men with mustaches, like sort of look the same to me. So I was having trouble distinguishing if it was like the men themselves, like their fantasies and they were acting them out, or if it was actors. But yeah, there's I definitely want to finish it because what I saw was really intriguing. There's a car sex scene, which I believe is a reference to Custom Car Commandos. And
Yeah.
there's twincest.
Ooh, boys, they're twincest. That is right. Yeah, I think the docu-porn, I think I wanted to mention just a little bit, and we can go back and talk about Wakefield Poole's Bible, because basically Wakefield Poole, after the success of Boys in the Sand and then the critical success of Bijou, made a film based on, vignettes, biblical vignettes. And it was a non-pornographic film. It had like kind of softcore elements. But it was kind of considered like like a box office failure, like didn't do nearly as well as the previous two films. And a lot of it has to do with like not having any hardcore gay pornography. I think it's like a really interesting, beautiful failure, and I think that maybe it suffered from being a little tepid in its objective, because it represents it has this bit of stunt casting where Georgina Spelvin from The Devil and Miss Jones, like golden age of porno royalty starlet, plays Bathsheba, and it's kind of like this like cheeky like kind of like sex romp where she's chased around the palace, but there's also these really beautiful lyrical moments where Candy Darling was supposed to be cast as the Virgin Mary, and then it somehow didn't work out, which would have been really beautiful to see. So it was like kind of considered a failure, even though it was like critically well received as far as I remember. And then cutting his losses, that's when he moved to San Francisco, and partnered and was perhaps revitalized by his partnership with the Nob Hill Cinema, which is where a lot of Take One takes place. And it does really, there's lots of interesting examples of docu-porn happening in the 70s. And there's these kind of like dual threads of docu-porn and like kind of experimental narrative that kind of overlap with each other in really generative and interesting ways throughout this period. And I think that's honestly a lot of what the contemporary curation of the San Francisco Porn Film Festival is doing. So that was like another through line for us that I thought was really resonant. But yeah, Take One has like these really interesting like oral narrations of men's fantasies, and like there's obviously this balletic or like this like kind of like choreographed impulse through all of Wakefield's work that like goes back to his history in the opera and with multimedia installation. I think the scene where the guy is coming on his steering wheel is so beautiful and so strange, and like he has this way of like using like split screen and like different projections that's like really really gorgeous, and also was kind of like used in Bijou as well, and was obviously kind of like a nod to like Andy Warhol and Chelsea Girls and like kind of like this pioneering split screen effect. But the way he does it in that particular scene in Take One is like so gorgeous, and also like I'm not sure how you feel about this, but like I know we a lot of the times we talk about like perhaps this porn was like ambiently erotic. Perhaps it wasn't like like I don't get like aroused by a lot of like a lot of the porn of this era, like you may feel differently, but I feel like since it was made for like cinema and for communal engagement, a lot of the time it's more of like an ambient arousal, and I feel like that car scene in particular was like so hot, but maybe it's just because like I'm a total slut for like Cronenberg and like J.G. Ballard and
It's really
like
hot.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm total slut for Cronenberg and J.G. Ballard too. I mean, actually, weirdly enough, out of like all three of these, this is the one I found the most like actively arousing.
Yes,
And it's because it's real people, I guess. And they're talking about their fantasies, and yeah, I was especially into the twincest sequence because I'm a disgusting little freak.
real life folks with immaculate mustaches.
It's insane. I can't believe that it exists. I mean, I know that there's like actual like twincest porn out there, but just to see it so casually dropped in this movie, I just like wasn't expecting that.
And they love each other so much, but they're also like used to playing like to hoodwinking each other and playing little tricks on each other.
Yes. Yeah, like one of the twins is they're both very butch, and both got these like handlebar mustaches, but one of them is I think when they were growing up was like more outwardly like queenie, and the other twin was more a jock, like into athletics, and they had tension because of that, because I think they sort of implied that their mother was sort of pitting them against each other. And like calling Freud, like there's so much here already. But when the athletic, and I'm not remembering their names, but when the more jockish brother started to come out, and he would go like hitchhiking, the other brother would like call his gay friends and orchestrate like his friends like picking him up, and it kind of implies like, you know, his friends like running a train on him. And it seems, I mean, that was like a way for them to have sex with each other without having sex with each other yet. And yeah, I mean, God, there's so much to get into with just twincest in particular that we don't have time for in this episode. But yeah, it's really they're so in love. They're so in love in this sequence.
Yeah, and I want to say like it's really kind of like unclear to when we were researching this, take one, if they're like actually like twins or if they're
Right.
brothers. They're neither Dutch and Rudy Valentino, but like the affect of their presence on screen is very much like twincest.
Yeah, and they look so much alike.
Yeah, it's nuts. And they also kind of like, you know, like work through this like S&M scenario together, but it's done with like such like tenderness
Yes.
that it's really it's hard to process on first watch. And also just maybe like an interesting you know, like segment relating to this idea of Wakefield maybe being a traditionalist in some ways and then like kind of like subversive in other unexpected ways.
Yeah.
And then, you know, like he said some cynical things like about how his career went after, you know, porn, and how he was always really interested in culinary arts and like kind of like, you know, I think trained as like a professional chef after a lot of the heyday of his porn making. And there's something interesting to say about that and like kind of like doing work that is like somatically nurturing in various incarnations, which I feel like I know a lot of like, you know, people who have been in the porn industry and sex workers who do kind of like work on like a somatic level, like, or like in like a way like with food and with sex. So I find that really interesting. And then he said something really wild about like how like his whole audience died out because of AIDS and how he like was addicted to cocaine and couldn't have sex. So like that's how cocaine saved his life from the AIDS epidemic, which I find
What?
a bit. Oh yeah,
That's insane.
You have some.
So crazy. Gay people are so nuts.
Well, he did say that, and it's like I couldn't tell from the context if it was just like wildly cynical and like inappropriate, or if it was like bittersweet, like
Right.
just like anecdotally like wistful. I don't know. But
Like, again,
yeah,
like
I
the
mean,
myth making here, like a lot of the time on this series, like we don't actually know if these guys mean what they say. Like we, you know, we're reading it, or we don't hear the tone of their voice, or you know, we just don't know. And yeah, especially with like this incest sequence, I mean, it seems to be, yeah, it's how tender it is subversive.
yes.
And it's, yeah, again, like we don't know if they're actually brothers. I certainly buy it. I mean, they look so much alike. But again, like I said, it could also be playing with this idea of how these gay men, I mean, dykes do this too, but gay men like twinning, you know, like being attracted to men that look like them, or, you know, there's so much of that like playful, like puckish narcissism in gay culture. I mean, most recently in Bruce LaBruce's film Saint Narcisse, which also has twincest in it. And it's kind of it's not so literal. It's not like, you know, the film is not this film and Saint Narcisse, you know, it's, yeah, of course, like the twincest, the kink of it is part of it, but it's also, again, a nod to the history of psychology, even about the homophobic notion that gay people are stunted, that they can only fall in love or have sex with like mirrors of themselves, and that's like part of the pathology and the sickness of homosexuality. So, and you see that a lot in representations of lesbians, in films that, you know, very much utilize like a male gaze. You know, there's the women often look alike, or, you know, there's this idea that like gay people are stunted because they can only love themselves, whereas like loving the opposite sex is like truly evolved or something.
Yeah, and I think that also speaks to like, you know, the myth of Narcissus that runs throughout Bijou too, where like he comes to the club and like, you know, also we have to mention that the character in Bijou is a construction worker who can only access like his latent homosexuality after a rich white woman is run over by a car, which she drops like this invitation that is a time-sensitive invitation to this club that becomes this kind of surreal odyssey. And yeah, when he first enters the club, he's surrounded by mirrors and reflections and surfaces and like things that are scintillating and like glitter and sequins and shining luminosity. And then the gaze of the camera is represented. It's all about reflections and surfaces and doppelgangers and, you know, self-image and public perception and spectacle of oneself and hyper masculine visibility. And I think a lot of that is, you know, obviously a very prominent thread that weaves through queer identity as well as queer cinema.
Absolutely. And I think that that's a really good note to end on for this episode. Again, Kamikaze, where can people find you on social media, and what are some other things that you're doing?
Yes, I totally do. So you can find me on Instagram and on Twitter at Kamikaze Jones _. And I am the arts editor of Wussy Magazine, which is a queer arts and culture magazine based in Atlanta. And we do have a new print issue coming out soon that I am extremely excited about. It's a Halloween issue and it also coincides with Atlanta Pride, but we have a lot of thrills, chills, and certainly spills. We have a really interesting photo essay and interview with two professional doms that I really admire that, Annie, I'm pretty sure you know, but I'm not going to spoil it quite yet. We have some amazing covers, and it was the first time that I actually got to be creative director for a cover shoot, so I'm really excited about that. And I don't want to spoil anything, but it's really, I think everyone that we got will particularly resonate with you, Annie.
Amazing. And you know where to find me as always. Girls Guts Giallo on Instagram, Girls Guts Giallo X on Twitter. Subscribe to my Patreon, patreon.com/girlsgutsgiallo. I make all my money this way. If you want to support me, check me out over there. And thank you for listening. And we'll be back with our final installment of Anal Auteurs. We're going to talk about Jack DeVoe. So we'll see you then.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for having me, Annie. And thank you again to the San Francisco Porn Film Festival. And continue to support DIY queer publications and festivals and cinema as much as you can.
Yes, the art you want to see is being made by your peers. So go support all.